Welcome to another episode of Just More Fix. This is James. With me in this episode is Lacey and Carrie. You can find us online at justmorefix.com or on Twitter at justmorefix. If you like us, you can support us at Patreon, and you can give us a rating and review at iTunes or wherever you find us at. In this episode, we're going to sit down with Jonathan Tweet. And now, it's time to get our gaming fix.
I'm Chris from All Things Good and Nerdy, a proud member of the Good and Geek Network, just like the show you're listening to right now. The opinions expressed are those of the individual hosts. Make sure you check out all the other great podcasts at GonnaGeekNetwork.com and get ready, because geekiness begins in 3, 2, 1.
Welcome to another episode of Just More Fix. So we are sitting down today with writer, game designer, and educator Jonathan Tweet. So for those out there that don't know who you are, why don't you give us an introduction and tell us about who you are?
Sure. I've been doing tabletop role-playing games professionally since 1987. I've done some self-publication, freelance work. I worked at Wizards of the Coast for years. So I've done a little of this and a little of that, revised other people's games, created my own. Big project was I was the lead designer on 3rd edition D&D. Back in 2000. So, I took that big ponderous system and put the armor class in the right direction and that sort of thing. And that was sort of my super crunchy game, with a rule for everything. And, right?
Yeah.
My, most of my role-playing games have been lighter than that and more story-oriented. So Ars Magica I did with Mark Reinhagen, and that was an early sort of streamlined mechanical system with more emphasis on character development. And then Over the Edge was one of the really early sort of indie style role-playing games with very light rules and an emphasis on setting and, creating an interesting character and really pulling the player in to be a co-creator of the experience rather than just sort of pulling a character out of a rule book, really creating a character that's unique. Did that like in Everway. And then my latest game with my best friend Rob Hainso is 13th Age. So that's a D20 style game, but with more story content and also just way faster, more interesting combat system. So he was the lead designer on 4th and I was the lead designer on 3rd. And 13th Age is what we do when we're not working for the man and we don't have to do, right? Like, if you're working on Dungeons and Dragons, it has to be a certain thing, right? Like, for instance, it has to be the same for everybody who plays it so that everyone can go to organized play and all have the same experience. Mm-hmm. So you have to have a character that anybody else could have created that exact character with the rules. And in 13th Age, the whole point is you create a character that nobody else in the world has ever created because there's free-form options for you to create features of your character that you invent rather than pull off a list. And another thing we did with that game is we went back to sort of, if you look at a lot of the old school game material, the person writing it is obviously a fan and a gamer and not a professional game designer. Mm-hmm. And they talk to the person reading it, right? Like it can be a conversation. And now rules writing has become very formal. So we sort of brought back some of that style of talking directly to the reader about why we have this rule and how you might want to do it differently and when you should break this rule. Or if Rob and I disagree on what the rules should be, we give you both versions and we each like to throw a little shit at the other guy about, he doesn't know how to design games or whatever. So, yeah, so that's 13th Age. And then, I know that one of the big things I wanted to talk about today is Grandmother Fish, and that's a whole separate, line of creativity for me where for 15 years I worked on a book that would teach evolution to little kids, and I finally figured out how to do it. And so when my daughter was little, years and years ago, I wanted her to have sort of the equivalent of a Garden of Eden, Adam and Eve book, something that is simple enough that a kid can understand it and tells that kid where we all came from. And there wasn't anything like that. And so I started working on it and never gave up and then finally figured out how to do it. And that was a couple of years ago. So I found a local artist. We collaborated. We raised money on Kickstarter. Originally I was going to just do it as a digital release so I wouldn't have to pay for printing because I was just going to sort of fund it out of my pocket and put it out there so that like all that work I'd been done for 15 years at least wouldn't be in vain, right? Mm-hmm. But when I told people about it, their eyes would light up, right? Evolution for kids, and wow, I got that reaction a couple of times and I realized that I was onto something and that it needed to be an actual book because people were into it. And so we raised money for it on Kickstarter and self-published, and we got a blog post on an NPR blog that went viral, and we sold out. And then pretty soon we got an agent, and 3 publishing houses were bidding on it, and we went with Macmillan, and inside Macmillan, a couple of different imprints all wanted it, and we talked with all the publishers about which imprint got to print it, and so that came out in 2016, and School Library Journal calls it groundbreaking, and so teachers love it. It's just really exciting after all these years to have this thing that was a labor of love come true.
Very cool.
And then I guess I want to talk about Clades is the other thing is that sort of bringing together my love of evolution in games is I did an animal matching game that teaches evolutionary relationships among animals, or like what a clade is in the first place. And that came out this year from Atlas Games. And then finally Atlas Games completed a Kickstarter to fund a new version of Over the Edge. So that's the really free-form game that I did back in 92. So now that's come back around and I've totally redone it with sort of, all the wisdom I have now as a seasoned game designer that I didn't have when I was, a young guy with a big idea.
Right.
So, and that closed it down that Kickstarter ended in August, and now we're putting the final touches on it. And I'm working on a big project for James Radji, which is a super great amount of fun. I'm going to be talking a lot about that when it's near publication. I want to build some publicity, but it's his 1630 setting. He talked me into doing the 1630 setting instead of something fantasy, and I think that was a great choice. And it's my Weird Island of Ala Marja from the Over the Edge game redone as a OSR product. It's super fun to go back to sort of old school gaming like I grew up on.
Mm-hmm. Oh, yeah.
Yeah, so that's where I am now, working on that project.
Okay, very cool. So the Grandmother Fish book, the illustrations for that and for the Clades game were both done by Karen Lewis.
Yeah.
And so can you tell us how you got hooked up with her?
Oh, sure. So I'm a professional game designer. I've lived here in Seattle for like over 20 years. So I know a lot of other game designers, and we all know creative people. And so my friend Rob Henso, the lead designer on 4th edition and the 13th Age guy that worked with me on that, he reminded me that there's this person I sort of knew named Karen Lewis, who's a mom and a children's book illustrator, and Rob got hold of her about the project, and she got excited right away because she knew that she could really do this project up right. Like she was just the right person for the book. So she is a children's science illustrator, among other things. And so she was able to really get the animals just right. Like I've had like a paleontologist could identify the genus of what grandmother fish is, like it's accurate enough that scientists appreciate it, but kids love it too. Yeah. So she turned out to be perfect. And because we could collaborate, we could work together to make the book better, the words and the illustrations and so forth. Usually there's no collaboration between the author and the artist because it's such a headache for the artist. But we work together back and forth, not just me trying to tell her what to do, but her giving me all sorts of advice. So that was a really great partnership. And so I wanted to work with her again for Clades. And then we've got several book ideas that we're going to start working on probably before the end of the year. We're going to start at least one of them.
I feel like that's when things really start to shine, is when the content of the book and the artwork sort of comes together seamlessly. Yeah. And that's when projects really, really shine because they match each other so perfectly. It's awesome. I don't know any other word to describe it. And our kids really, really love it.
Thanks. Yeah, no, she was great. She's super fine. Yeah.
So you mentioned you'd been working on this project for a long time. Obviously, evolution is a huge topic, and you're writing a book for preschoolers, so you can't dump all of that information. So how big of a problem was it to try and condense that into something that a preschooler could digest in a meaningful way?
It's a giant problem, super giant headache, right? Like, because if you don't give kids context, they don't know. It's hard for them to even understand what the story is, right? Like the world was so different long ago when whatever grandmother fish lived 400 million years ago. Can you even explain that, right? Or and if you don't explain it, what kind of impression are they getting? So, I struggled for years on how do you provide the information that kids kind of need, but do it in such a way that it's interesting enough for them to take in. And there was a time 10 years into the project where I thought it was ready. I thought, oh, wow, this is great. I read my own book and I think it's wonderful. and I was going to send it to New York publishers. And I talked with someone who's in the children's book industry, and she read it over and she kind of told me it was not ready for prime time. I've done enough playtesting to know that you really need to listen to negative feedback, even if you don't want to. Mm-hmm. And so I didn't send it off, and instead I just sort of kept noodling on it. How do you do that? And finally the answer that hit me is you have the kids act things out. Right. You have them do sounds or motions or whatever. So they wiggle like a fish and they hoot like an ape. And when I came across that idea, when it hit me, right, I shook all over. It was so exciting.
You wiggle.
Right? Yeah, wow, that's it. Wow, I've been working on this for years, and bang!
Wiggle like a game designer.
Yeah, and so that worked like a charm. And the thing about that is if you get kids to engage bodily, kinesthetically or vocally, then you can reach really small kids. Mm-hmm. I've seen 1-year-olds, follow what is being said to some degree, and they're doing mimicry, right? And so if you try to get a kid to mimic an ape grabbing with its hand, you can grab with your hand, and the little kid will mimic you, right? So it reaches much younger kids than I ever thought possible, and so that meant I have to strip it down to really bare bones, so that it would keep the attention of a little kid. And it just really sort of focuses on all the actions that these animals do. Kids love animals. They love families. They love mimicking things. It sort of hits all the things that we evolved to respond to as we learn as young people. So, yeah. That's why it was so hard to do. If I were trying to do that book for money, I would have given up years ago, right?
Yeah.
So only a passion project, only something that you're going to work on for its own sake, would get someone like me to think about something for 15 years and finally get it right.
Our kids are a little bit older, so they really enjoyed the book too. And I find when you give them the prompts to do these different things, we don't even have to do the action first. They're already like, oh, okay, well, wiggle like a fish. I'm on this, and they're already participating. Yeah. So, and it kind of makes it a book they want you to read to them again because it's fun.
It is, exactly. Yeah, even older kids have a great time. I read it to groups of adults, right? Lots of adults are looking for an excuse to wiggle.
Absolutely. I also like how the content is easy enough for them to understand without sacrificing some of the important terminology. So just the word mammal and, the other scientific words that are in the book, we kind of shortchange kids sometimes thinking they're not going to be able to understand that word. And maybe that's true, but if they're introduced to it at a younger age, then it's not so intimidating when it comes around later out of the blue.
I think that's a really important point, that the concept of a mammal is not something that the brain is wired to understand. The brain is wired for these one-on-one relationships where that's a dog, that's a spider, that's a fish. And science puts these into categories, right? Those are mammals. And that is not natural or easy. And so by presenting it in this way, well, a mammal is just one of the grandchildren of grandmother mammal. Now it's easy to sort of understand that. Like, what's a mammal versus a bird? Well, a bird is a child of grandmother reptile like we are, but not grandmother mammal. Yeah, I think it's really important to just get that idea, mammal, right, into people's heads. And that's also what the Clades game is all about. The three main clades are the mammals, the arthropods, and the sauropsids. And sauropsid that's the branch of the evolutionary tree that includes all the reptiles and birds together as one group.
And I think between the familial terms and the movements, you're reinforcing the fact that there's been a passage of time, but that we're still interconnected. And I think that really clicks with little kids.
Mm-hmm. I think just the use of the word grandmother really does it too, because most kids can easily identify with what a grandparent is at some level. And then when you connect that to apes and fish and reptiles, it sort of makes it sort of a pretty heady concept in a very easy and relatable way.
Yeah. And I like what Carrie said about the motions helping you feel connected, mm-hmm. right? Because that sort of really is the idea. Like when the kid first hears a story and they're chomping and wiggling like a fish, they just take it for granted that they can chomp and wiggle. And by the end, they've learned that, well, the whole reason you can chomp and wiggle is because you're a grandchild of grandmother fish. That's where you got it.
Yeah, well, even high schoolers have this really hard time with it because they cannot draw a connection from where they're at now to that. They don't see it.
Yeah.
And so I think that helps reinforce that idea.
Yeah, so on Twitter, I just this last week saw a teacher reading Grandmother Fish to what looked like high school students in the classroom because I had to learn stuff about evolution to write this book, as simple as it is. And like I remember getting to college and not understanding how evolution works as well as a kid who knows Grandmother Fish understands it.
Well, and with the high schoolers, like the content of the actual book itself is pretty simple, but then in the back, there's that tree that branches out and there's different terminology that you explain in a much more kind of adult sort of way to help you add more to the teaching of the book itself.
Yeah.
And even if...
Yeah. I'm such a geek, that I had to put a whole bunch of science stuff in the back just because I had to think through all the science of who these grandmothers are, like who is grandmother mammal and when did she live and what was she up to? And so I felt like I needed to share that. And it was, I was self-publishing so I could write whatever I wanted.
I think it makes a lot of sense anyway, because when you're selling a children's book, yes, you're selling it to children, but the person buying it is a parent usually. And so some of that extra content is what kind of draws you as a parent to pick up this book.
And then children just love to ask questions as well. So it's nice to be able to have the content of the book, but then also sort of arm the parents or the readers to be able to answer questions that are never going to come up from children. So
Right. And I sort of set it up as, here's some ways that you might want to describe this to your kids. But of course, parents are going to be learning a lot about the science from that stuff in the back.
Mm-hmm. Right.
And so they need to, like, I had to learn more about evolution to write the book. Parents are going to need to learn about evolution in order to answer the questions. And then, it's great.
So you mentioned when you first started taking under this task, it was because there was a complete lack of this at all. And being somebody who is a science lover myself, I have often browsed the nonfiction section at the Children's Public Library, and it is not ample by any stretch of the imagination. It has gotten better recently, for sure, with books like this and just a variety of other science topics coming out. But so out of all of the topics, why evolution? What is it about evolution that really hooked you and was like, this is the one I want to do?
Right. Why do Christians have a story about Adam and Eve? Right? Is because people want to know where we came from and why things are the way they are. Like that's an important part of bringing up your kids is saying, this is the world that you got born into, and this is how it got this way, and here's your context for what's going on in your life. And so kids from science-oriented families need the same thing that kids from creationist families need. They need the story of where we all came from and how you fit in this overwhelmingly large and complicated planet. And so it's such an important story about who you are. And we taped people for the Kickstarter video. We taped parents reading the book for the first time to their kids. That was back before the book was even really illustrated. It was just sketches. And we caught on tape the instant when a 6-year-old sees her mom turn the page and there's grandmother human on the page. And the 6-year-old realizes that, wow, this whole story's been about me. This is a story about where I came from. And she's so flabbergasted that she can't even find her words, and she stammers out something about grandmother human, but you can see exactly what's going on in her head. So it's the most important story. Like, every culture has wanted to have a creation story to describe who they are and where they come from. And we have a creation story that's true. That's better than any other, right? Like, wow, of course you want kids to know the creation story, especially if it's true.
One of the things that I like about it the most is that Lacey mentioned the nonfiction section being so small, and I feel like you don't really get introduced to science until you're like late middle school a lot of times.
Yeah.
And so much of it, I think it becomes intimidating because you haven't been exposed to it at a young age. And that moment of realization that you're talking about right there, and then you mentioned earlier using real terminology, it makes things so much easier to tackle and draws people in more towards science at an earlier age. And I think it lays an easy foundation to start off.
That's right. And, I think scientific thinking is great. It's led to also, not just technological advances, but like scientific thinking really tries to be unbiased. And so it's a way of looking at things abstractly rather than from your own perspective. Mm-hmm. And that's really important. And you're totally right about there's not enough sort of nonfiction. So I wanted to see what Grandmother Fish would be up against, like how it should look compared to the other books. So I went to bookstores looking for the preschool science section. There's no preschool science section. And so Grandmother Fish, a preschool book, gets lodged in with like the grade school books because that's where the science books go. Mm. Well, there should be a preschool science section.
Yeah, along that vein, are you planning on putting out more preschool science books?
Yes, yeah. So Karen and I are going to get together in the next week or two and sort of really start working on a storyboard for another book for kids. And all the books that I want to do are sort of big idea books. Here in Western civilization, for the first time, we really understand what the universe is and what the earth is and what the stars are and how living things work. We understand so much that people didn't used to understand it. There's no reason that kids cannot be taught this at an early age so that they grow up really understanding the world around them like no one ever used to. It's exciting.
Introduced to a way of thinking about things. So I have kind of a weird question.
Okay.
Did you have any problems getting this? I know we're a long way from 1925 and the Scopes monkey trial, but did you have any problems getting this in the libraries, especially in public education areas?
That is a good question. I think that libraries mostly buy through distributors. Mm-hmm. So it's hard to, I don't know that Macmillan even knows what the input, the placement is in libraries. The Seattle Library has several copies. So, and teachers tend to really like it. And, School Library Journal recommended it for home library and school. So it's really more a question of getting people to know it, because librarians usually aren't looking for a book about evolution for preschoolers because they don't even
that section is so small
that such a thing would exist, right? Mm-hmm. So no, we didn't. There was, I know there was a major retail chain that the publisher thought might not take any, and they took some. So even that's the worst I've ever heard of any kind of.
That's really cool. That's very heartening. I like to hear that.
So everybody listening should go to a bookstore and ask if they have Grandmother Fish, or go to a library, or buy a copy for your kids' teacher, or buy a copy for your kid's school. Or it's like, now that it's been published by Macmillan, schools and libraries can buy it. A lot of times librarians don't have the authority to buy self-published material because they're not trusted to spend the dollars or whatever. But it's from Macmillan. Any school or library can buy it.
I know that all the libraries I've worked with, as soon as it's requested, if they have dollars left, they're going to buy it. If a teacher in the building wants it in their building, they're going to buy it. And then with whatever's left over, they go with, as you mentioned, the Library Association, whatever they recommend.
So it really is a question of just getting the word out there, right? It's, we had a viral blog post on an NPR blog that made the first edition sell out, but it seems like for the second edition from Macmillan, most of the big reviews have been like behind a paywall or something. Like the School Library Journal, raving review, but it's behind a paywall, so it can't ever go viral.
So the book is kind of marketed for the age range 3 to 6. And then the Clades game is more for age 6 and up. Was there like a strategic decision behind making the game for slightly older kids?
It was more like I came up with the idea for the game, and it's a game for older kids.
Okay.
That was really it. It's not so much that I set out to create another evolution game. In the same way that I was noodling on Grandmother Fish for years. For years, I've also been trying to figure out how you would do an evolution game that gets the science right. It's really easy to do an evolution game that just trashes the science. And so that's been something I've thought about over and over again. I did research in evolution in order to write Grandmother Fish. I learned what a clade is, and that was a really big idea. And we're really excited about that. And then I was talking with my daughter about stuff, and I came up with an idea for, wow, at last, how you can do an evolution game. And that's it. And there you go. So, and by that time, I was already working with Karen. And so it was really easy just to do it again and then go on Kickstarter, raise more money. And we've got connections with Atlas Games in Minnesota. They publish my Over the Edge game and Feng Shui and lots of great stuff. So they are distributing the Clades game. So we send it out to backers, both Clades, which is living animals, and Clades Prehistoric is all extinct animals. So it's dinosaurs and pterosaurs and that sort of thing. So that's where Clades came from.
So you kind of already had the working relationship with Atlas Games.
Yeah.
So did it take some convincing then to get them to do this, or were they kind of like, oh, we've worked with you before, you have like street cred?
Yeah, no, it was pretty easy. It's they have a lot of games. They've got a lot of card games, more casual games. They've got full-on tabletop role-playing games, like Feng Shui and Unknown Armies and Over the Edge, and then they've got more casual card games and board games. And so it's really easy for them to add something to the line. And they had contacts in China for like how to get it produced in a nice tin box that's pretty. And so they helped out that way. And it's really nice that I can have the game in the market and I'm not literally shipping it like we did with Grandmother Fish in the very first edition. So yeah, I love working with John too. He's a dad. His son really likes Clades because he loves dinosaurs and patterns, and so
dinosaurs are always an easy sell. Everybody seems to have this fascination with them.
Pretty easy sell.
So, has this process with Clades and Grandmother Fish been kind of different because in the way that RPGs are a kind of a small market, and it seems like Clades and Grandmother Fish have really blown up and gone a lot of places that a lot of RPGs don't. So has this entire experience been drastically different from the other games and designs that you've done?
That's interesting. It's sort of yes and no. Like the process is all different. I never worked with an agent before, and so that is weird and different and okay, I guess. But especially the way that we put grandmother fish and Clades together. It's like Karen and me working. It's not in a garage, but she's got a little studio somewhere with no windows, right? And where she works on her giant Mac screen, and so it really was. It's a lot like self-publishing role-playing games. Mm-hmm. You're creating stuff, you're testing it, you're adapting to feedback. The big difference is, we got a big advance with grandmother fish, and mostly I've gotten royalties or money when the Kickstarter's up. Right. But yeah, it's kind of easy to do both jobs at once. Like there's kind of the same thing. I have to learn more. I have to, now contacting a museum is different from contacting a game store or whatever. So that's been new. But yeah, for the most part, it feels very comfortable.
I absolutely love including games in my classroom, and I like that Clades is a card game, so it's cheap. A lot of historical, so I teach history, so a lot of historical games are massive things, and it's also something you can do in a class period. So it's 6 and over, which is awesome. Have you thought about adapting it for high schoolers, like including species and all the other scientific classifications and making it harder?
So the game is played a lot like Set, if you know that game, mm-hmm. where everybody's gathered around looking at a bunch of cards and trying to spot the triple that's in it, mm-hmm. right? The 3 cards that go together according to a specific pattern. So that means if you're high school students, it's as hard as the other high school students are good. Right? And so it's like a race. Like no matter what age you are, you can race against people your same age, and it's still a challenge. Mm-hmm. And so it really is ages 6+, not like 6 to 12 or 6 to 10. And it's a brain game. So I know it's been used in middle schools. I'm sure it would be fine in high schools. It's sort of the more sophisticated the students are that you're playing the game with, the more detail you can go in and giving the context for the game. So there are science notes about what all the different groups of animals are that are on the cards, and something about how they evolved, or what defines them. And with high school students, you can just go into more detail. And I've got a video online of a webinar that I did. It's from the Teacher Institute of Evolutionary Science as part of the Richard Dawkins Foundation. And so this is a webinar for teachers on how to use grandmother fish and Clades in a classroom. And so I talked about how you can use the cards in Clades to talk about most recent common ancestors and all sorts of sort of more sophisticated concepts.
That's really cool. We appreciate that stuff being done for us.
Well, it makes the whole process easier. It's hard enough to keep a bunch of kids around engaged by just, talking. It's great with games or whatever. So
it's a great game for a group because you're not taking turns, and sort of any number of people can play at once.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I just kind of started looking at the Clades. I haven't been able to play it yet. So it's for a group. It's kind of based on everybody's skill level, like you mentioned. How long does a game take?
It's like 15 minutes. It depends. Well, so this is going to depend on how good the players are.
Right.
Right. It's like, there's 81 cards, so you're going to go through 20-some matches, 25 matches, and then how long is it going to take for people to spot a match? Usually it's going to be under a minute. It's almost always going to be under a minute, but if they're spotting them really quickly because you've got a lot of people and they're older, they'll spot the matches really quickly, and you go through those 25 matches fast. And if they're younger and they need help and hints and that sort of thing, it'll take longer. You can also, if you're worried, if you're playing with small kids and you want to make it go fast, just play with half the deck. Right? Like the game plays just fine, and it just comes to an end faster.
So you have some other science books in mind. Are there other science-themed games in mind also?
I would like to do a game that where you follow the natural selection and the adaptation of organisms. It would have to be a digital game so that things could replicate and so that things could mutate. So that's that's another idea. I've just been noodling on, and I figured out how would that be fun? How would that be whatever? I do I do have a solar system game that I'm working on actually for a publisher that sells a lot to homeschoolers. So they did not want an evolution game because too many homeschoolers won't accept that. Mm-hmm. And so I wanted to do a solar system game because I also think another big idea that little kids can know is that we're in a solar system. Like we're a tiny little rock spinning around a giant, fusion bomb.
Terrifying.
But kids love it.
Yeah. And so like this is a way where little kids could understand the universe better than Aristotle did. Mm-hmm. Like imagine that. What a change it is for our society that little kids can look around and really understand the universe, right? Understand why the moon's phases are the way that it is. So I want to do a solar system game, and I think I've been noodling on that for a year. And last week I figured out, that's how to make it work. So you see how I work, I guess. How these projects go.
So along with all these games and your RPG background, have you thought about or done things to sort of make RPGs for younger audiences?
Yes, I have. So I've done that informally, just doing stuff with younger kids, and sometimes I'll invent a freeform system for littler kids or something like that. And I did a lot with beginner sets for Dungeons and Dragons, and those tend to be aimed at younger kids. I think usually the age range is 10 or higher. Mm-hmm. And I've done some sort of free-form role-playing with kids, and I don't have like a kids game product to point to, though I might want to work on one day. One of the nice things about 13th Age is that it is designed to empower the creativity of the players. And kids come to the role-playing game, and a lot of times they understand right away sort of the back and forth of you see someone walking down the street toward you. What do you say to them? Like they understand make-believe and one of the things you do in 13th Age is you create a unique thing that makes your character different from, basically any other character that anybody has ever created in the history of the world. Because you can, it's like you're creating a literary character in a book, and you create sort of a trait. So one guy says he's got a clockwork heart that's built by the dwarves, or, in our latest campaign, Rob Henso's character is the offspring of Rakshasas and ogre mages. And so that explains where his, powerful monk things come from. And the other thing it lets you do is you can basically just rewrite the fiction, the lore that goes along with a class or a race if you're the only one at the table with that. So for example, a friend of mine was teaching a kid 13th Age, and the kid said, "Can I be the only survivor from my village?" And the game master says, "You can be the only surviving dark elf in the whole world." Like this is about you making stuff up. The kid's mind was blown. So I think that's a great example of sophisticated concept that hardcore role players can really sink their teeth into, but also just kids are good at making stuff up and they like it. And so that's one of the reasons I like teaching 13th Age to kids. I like teaching them young that, it's their creativity that counts, that they're bringing something to the game.
Instead of choosing from a list, they're able to use their own creativity without constraints on it, basically.
Exactly.
You're empowering them.
Well, some constraints, but it's like but the important thing is that you're not picking from a list.
Right.
You're coming up with something that sort of suits a player character, but you're inventing it, not picking it. Mm-hmm.
Between designing a book for kids and designing RPG games for kids, do you have any advice for people that are maybe wanting to design a game for kids, like things to do or things to avoid?
Yeah, I think, kids like to act things out. Kids like to engage creatively. And so the traditional role-playing format is very sensory deprivation, right? Like it's right. It's super abstract. Uh-huh. And so anything that that engages the kid on a more, I want to say, visceral level. Even if it's just funny voices or that sort of thing, but being able to draw something, being able to name something, being able to invent something, some way for the kid to be involved physically or creatively in the game rather than sort of just talking about it using numbers. That's what I would recommend.
Sensory deprivation is such a on the nose way to put it, because as you just sit here and sometimes you don't consider things, and it's like, wow, it really is that way.
Yeah.
I need to be in this box so I can picture everything as if it's around me. Do you have any plans to design an RPG game that is also educational? So I know you said that you want to design more games, you want to write more books.
Right.
I really like RPGs, and I really want there to be more educational ones.
So I kind of looked into that in the past and maybe haven't recently. So maybe it's one of those conundrums that I noodle on, right? It's like, and so maybe before I die, I'll figure it out, or maybe I'll die and it'll be one of the things I'm still noodling on. So but thanks for asking that, because I haven't thought about that very much and recently, and now that apps are so easy to design and distribute, I think there might be ways to sort of provide more interactive content for educational role-playing games than used to be available. So I'll have to give that some thought.
I love it. I love the idea. I mean, I've done a lot of simulations, which is nothing more than role-playing with a fancy name that teaches you something, right. And I want to see more of that.
Huh. Okay. Well, I'm going to keep thinking about that. That's for sure.
Was there anything else that you were hoping to talk about while we're all here? Anything else you wanted to plug, or?
I guess I'd like to say I'm really approachable on social media. So I've got a writer page on Facebook, and most of my geek interactivity is on Google+. I'm that big of a geek, so I'm easy to find there, and I'm on Twitter. So, I'd love to hear from people. And so Grandmother Fish is in those places, and then me, Jonathan Tweet, I'm also there.
And we'll link to your page, and then also to where people can find Grandmother Fish if they want to pick it up.
Yeah, and so I would just say to people listening, if education and evolution for little kids seems like a good idea to you, we just need people to help spread the word.
Well, and even the people that don't necessarily agree that it's the truth, there's nothing wrong in teaching your child multiple ways to think about something and letting them make up their own mind.
Yeah.
Very good.
I'll put Grandmother Fish up against any other kid's book on where we came from. Absolutely. any day. Yeah.
We will link to all of the Grandmother Fish and Clades and you in the show notes there. So if people want to reach out and find you or any of your games and stuff, it'll be there. And
when you're ready to promote any of this other stuff, we like Grandmother Fish, and so whatever else you have coming up, drop us a line and we'll be happy to have you back on if you want to talk about something else.
Okay, that sounds fun.
All right. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Nice meeting you, Carrie, and nice seeing the two of you again. So
thank you.
Thanks for this opportunity. Take care.
All right, you too.
Thanks for listening. This has been an episode of Just One More Fix. Music has been provided by Kevin MacLeod. You can find him at incompetech.com. You can support us at patreon.com/JustOneMoreFix or follow us on Twitter at JustOneMoreFix.